She was 20 years old the winter the world took everything from her, and left her standing alone on a muddy riverbank with a canvas satchel, 43 pesos sewn into her hem, and nowhere left to call home. Her name was Elena Marquez, and the man who cast her out was her father's own cousin, Don Rafael Contreras, a landholder whose smile was as smooth as the polished mahogany of his hacienda, and whose heart, as the townsfolk of Rio Verde would come to learn, was carved from something far colder. He told her, standing in the doorway of the house her father had built with his own hands, that the land was his now, signed over in a debt she had never seen, and that she had until sundown to be gone. With those 43 pesos and nothing else, Elena wandered to the edge of town, where the old land office was auctioning off a piece of jungle wreckage nobody wanted, a rusted cargo plane, swallowed by vines and silence for 60 long years, sold for the price of a sack of rice because the locals swore it was cursed. Everyone called her a fool for spending her last coins on a dead man's plane. But sealed somewhere inside that wreck was a secret that had waited 6 decades to be found. One that would not only change the course of Elena's life, but would restore an entire town to what it was always meant to be. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Elena Marquez. If you have ever felt like you were starting from absolutely nothing, with only your own 2 hands and a stubborn kind of hope, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one mean something to you, consider following or subscribing to our channel so you never miss the next tale of someone the world gave up on too soon. Rio Verde was the kind of town that clung to the edge of the jungle, the way a candle flame clings to its wick, small, stubborn, and always one strong wind away from going out. It sat where the river bent sharply around a limestone bluff, in a country whose name mattered less than its climate, its customs, and the particular green hush of its forests. Somewhere in the humid heart of Latin America in the year 1994, though the town itself had scarcely changed since the 1930s, when the roads were dirt and the church bell still rang by hand. Elena had been born in a wooden house on the north side of that river, the only daughter of Tom's Marquez, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who repaired boat engines and radios for anyone who brought them to him, regardless of whether they could pay. Her mother had died when Elena was 6, of a fever that swept through the lowlands that year, and so it was her father who raised her, who taught her, patiently, over long evenings lit by kerosene lamps, how to read the insides of a machine the way other girls learned to read scripture. He taught her that nothing broken was ever truly worthless, only misunderstood, and that the measure of a person's worth was never in what they were given, but in what they chose to build from what remained. Elena grew up with grease under her fingernails and her father's old radio manuals stacked beside her bed, and by the time she was 15, she could take apart an outboard motor and put it back together with her eyes half closed, could coax a dead battery back to life, could listen to the sound of an engine and tell you, before it failed, exactly where the trouble lived. The other girls in Rio Verde thought her strange for it, but her father only smiled and told her that the world was full of things people threw away too quickly, and that a person who could see value where others saw junk would never truly be poor. It was a lesson she carried the way some people carry a name, quietly and completely, and it shaped everything that came before and everything that came after. Tom's was well liked in Rio Verde, respected even by the wealthier families who normally looked past men of his station, because he had a gift for fixing what others declared unfixable, and because he never once, in all his years, turned away a neighbor in need. He spoke often of Elena's grandfather, a riverboat captain who had vanished during the Great Flood of 1934, the same flood that had swallowed half the old town, and as legend had it, claimed a cargo plane that never made it out of the jungle with supplies meant to save Rio Verde's dying. The story had passed into folklore by the time Alina was grown, the kind of tale old men told over card games, embellished with each retelling until no one quite believed the plane had existed at all. But Tom's always spoke of it with a strange seriousness, as though some part of him knew it was more than myth, and he would grow quiet whenever the subject arose, his eyes drifting toward the green wall of jungle beyond the river, as if searching for something lost there. Alina did not understand, in those years, why her father's face changed when he spoke of the old plane, or why he kept a small brass key in a cigar box beneath his workbench, a key that fit no lock she had ever seen. She only knew that he was the finest man she had ever known, that he loved her fiercely and without condition, and that when he died, suddenly, of a failing heart, 3 years before this story truly begins, she lost not only her father, but the only steady ground she had ever stood on. It was after his death that Don Rafael Contreras, her father's cousin by marriage and the wealthiest man in the region, produced a debt Elena had never known existed. A paper bearing her father's signature that she would later come to doubt with everything in her, and used it to claim the house, the land, and everything her father had spent his life building. She was left, at 20 years old, with the cigar box, the strange brass key, 43 pesos, and a grief so heavy it settled into her bones like winter into old wood. The fall came slowly, and then, all at once, the way such things often do, until Elena could no longer tell which losses had broken her, and which she had simply grown numb to. In the months after her father's death, she had tried, with a determination that surprised even herself, to keep the small repair shop running, waking before dawn to fix radios and boat motors for the fishermen who still trusted her hands, even though half the town whispered that a young woman had no business doing a man's work. She managed, for a time, to make enough to eat, to keep the roof from leaking, to pay the small debts that came due each month, and there were nights she allowed herself to believe she might survive this after all, might carve out some small, stubborn life on the bones of her father's legacy. But Don Rafael had other plans, and men like him rarely lost. He came to her one evening in his pressed linen suit, smelling of cigar smoke and cologne, and told her with a courtesy that made her skin crawl that her father had borrowed heavily against the house years before, that the debt had come due, and that as her nearest male relative, he had settled it himself, and that the property was now his. When Elena asked to see the paper, he produced it with practiced ease, and though something in her gut told her the signature was wrong, too straight, too careful, too unlike the tired scrawl her father used at the end of long days, she had no lawyer, no money, and no one in Rio Verde willing to stand against a man who controlled half the region's land and half its debts besides. The town watched her lose everything the way a town watches a storm pass over a neighbor's house, with sympathy but no interference, because to interfere with Don Rafael was to invite his attention onto oneself, and few could afford that risk. Within a season, she had lost the workshop, the house, her father's tools, and what little standing she'd had in Rio Verde's narrow society. And she found herself, one gray morning, standing on the riverbank with a single canvas satchel containing a change of clothes, her father's cigar box, and the 43 pesos she had managed to hide before the eviction. She thought, more than once in those weeks, of leaving Rio Verde entirely, of taking a boat downriver to the city where no one knew her name and starting over as someone else, someone without a stolen inheritance, and a town full of people too afraid to help her. But something kept her there, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps grief, perhaps the quiet certainty her father had planted in her, that nothing was ever truly finished being valuable, and so she stayed, sleeping some nights in the loft above the chapel, when the old priest, Padre Anselmo, took pity on her, and other nights in whatever shelter the riverbank offered, until word came through town of an auction at the land office, a clearing of old, unclaimed properties from the government's books, most of them worthless plots of jungle no one wanted. It was Padre Anselmo who mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that among the properties was the wreck of an old cargo plane, buried in vines somewhere past the eastern ridge, the very same plane the old men spoke of from the flood of 1934, the one folklore claimed was cursed because everyone aboard it had vanished into the jungle and never been found. The land office wanted it gone from their ledgers, and the opening price, scrawled almost carelessly on the auction notice, was 15 pesos, less than the cost of a week's food, a price so low it was less an offer than an admission that no one believed the wreck was worth anything at all. Alina stood in the crowded little room of the land office on auction day, surrounded by men bidding on parcels of farmland and river frontage, and when the clerk finally called out the cargo plane wreck, a ripple of laughter passed through the room, because everyone knew the old superstition, that the plane had taken its crew and never given them back, that the jungle around it was unlucky, that only a fool would want a rusted hulk of metal 60 years buried in root and vine. No one raised a hand. The clerk called the price a second time, then a third, ready to strike it from the books entirely, and it was in that moment, with her father's voice echoing somewhere in the back of her mind, telling her that nothing broken was ever truly worthless, that Alina heard herself speak, her voice steadier than she felt, offering the full 15 pesos for a heap of jungle-buried metal that everyone else in the room considered less than garbage. The clerk blinked at her, uncertain whether to laugh along with the rest of the room or simply accept the bid. And in the end, business being business, he accepted it. And just like that, for a sum barely worth mentioning, Elena Marquez became the owner of a 60-year-old wreck that no living soul in Rio Verde wanted. She heard the whispers as she left the office, foolish girl, throwing away her last coins on a dead man's plane, as though poverty had addled what little sense she had left. But she did not turn to answer them, because some quiet, wordless part of her had already decided that this was not foolishness but faith. The same kind of faith her father had shown every time he took apart a ruined engine and found, deep in its corroded heart, something worth saving. It took her the better part of 2 days to find the wreck, hiking east along an overgrown trail that the townspeople rarely used, guided by an old hunter named Bartolo, who remembered, as a boy, glimpsing pieces of metal through the trees after the flood, though he had never gone close, out of respect for whatever spirits the old folks believed still lingered there. When Elena finally stood before it, parting a curtain of vines with her bare hands, she felt something catch in her throat that had nothing to do with fear. The cargo plane lay half buried in the red earth, its fuselage split along one seam, its wings folded back by decades of storms and roots grown thick as a man's arm through its shattered windows, and painted along its rusted nose, faded almost to nothing, were the words El Condor Dorado. She spent that first afternoon simply walking its length, running her palm along the cold metal the way her father used to run his hand along a stalled engine before ever touching a tool, listening, in her own quiet way, to what the machine still had to tell her. It was near the tail section, where the jungle floor had swallowed the fuselage almost entirely, that she found the cargo hold still sealed shut, its door warped but intact, and working for hours with a crowbar borrowed from Bartolo, sweat soaking through her blouse and her hands raw with effort. She finally forced it open to reveal a hold packed with the rotted remains of medical crates, their contents long since destroyed by 6 decades of jungle damp, except for one thing, bolted to the floor at the very back, untouched by rot because it had been built, quite deliberately, to survive. It was a case of dark, riveted steel, roughly the size of a small trunk, fitted with a heavy lock whose keyhole matched, with an exactness that made Alina's breath catch, the strange brass key her father had kept hidden in his cigar box for as long as she could remember. Alina did not open the case that first day, though every instinct in her strained toward it. Instead, she sat beside it, in the fading jungle light with her father's key pressed into her palm. Overwhelmed by the sudden, dizzying certainty that her father had known something about this plane, had perhaps known it his whole life, and had never told her why, she carried the case back to Rio Verde with Bartolo's help, the two of them hauling it on a makeshift sled through 2 days of jungle trail. And when she finally sat alone in the chapel loft that Padre Anselmo allowed her, she took the brass key from its box and fit it into the lock with hands that would not quite stop trembling. It turned with a groan of old metal, and when the case fell open, Alina found herself staring not at gold, not at jewels, but at something far stranger and, in its own way, far more valuable. A thick bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the damp, alongside a leather-bound ledger and a stack of letters tied with ribbon, gone brittle with age. The papers, when she carefully unfolded them beneath the lamplight, revealed themselves to be land grants. Dozens of them, bearing the official seals of the regional government from decades before. Each one recording the rightful ownership of parcels along the river. Parcels that included, she realized with a jolt that ran through her entire body, the very land Don Rafael now claimed as his own. The ledger, written in a careful, looping hand she did not recognize, detailed the founding families of Rio Verde and the boundaries of their land, cross-referenced with names that Elena knew, names still living in the town today. Families who had long believed their ancestral claims lost in the Great Flood of 1934, when the old land office had burned, and so everyone believed, every original deed with it. But here they were, safe and dry inside a steel case that had survived 60 years buried in the jungle, because someone, and the letters, when she finally read them, told her exactly who had chosen, on the night of the flood, to load the town's most precious records onto the last cargo plane out of Rio Verde rather than let them burn or drown, entrusting them to a young pilot named Captain Ezequiel Duarte, a man the letters described in words of aching tenderness as gentle, brave, and deeply beloved by the town's founding families. The final letter, dated the night before the crash, and addressed to no one in particular, as though the writer had known there might be no one left to receive it, explained that the plane also carried a modest sum in gold coin, donated by the founding families themselves, intended to build Rio Verde's first hospital, a project the flood had interrupted, and death had apparently buried along with the plane. Alina read that letter 3 times through, her hands unsteady, before she understood, with a clarity that made the small hairs on her arms rise, that her own grandfather, the riverboat captain who had vanished in that same flood, had been the one entrusted with delivering the brass key to Captain Duarte's family after the crash. A task he had evidently never completed, perhaps because he too had been lost that terrible night, leaving the key, and its secret, to pass down through her father instead, unopened and unexplained, for 60 years. It did not take long for word to travel through a town as small as Rio Verde that Elena Marquez had found something in the old plane wreck, and it took even less time for that word to reach Don Rafael Contreras, who arrived at the chapel 2 days later in his pressed linen suit, his expression arranged into the same courteous mask he had worn the day he took her father's house. He asked, with feigned casualness, what exactly she had found out there in the jungle. And when Elena, guided by a caution she did not entirely understand herself, told him only that she had found old family records, his eyes sharpened in a way that confirmed every suspicion she had never quite let herself voice. He offered to buy the contents of the case from her outright, naming a sum that would have seemed enormous to her a week earlier, and when she declined, he grew colder, reminding her, with quiet menace, that she was still a young woman alone in his town, dependent on the goodwill of people who answered, in one way or another, to him. Alina understood then, with a clarity sharpened by grief and grown sharper still by defiance, that the land grants in that steel case were not merely her family's history, but a direct threat to everything Don Rafael had built his fortune upon. Because if the original deeds proved that the land he now controlled had never legally belonged to his family at all, his entire empire of debts and holdings would begin to crumble. She spent the following days quietly showing the ledger to the very families named within it, the Solanos and the Reyes and the Figueroas. Elderly townspeople who had grown up believing their grandparents' land claims had burned in the flood decades before, and watching their faces as they recognized their own family names in that careful, looping hand was, Alina would later say, one of the few moments of pure light in an otherwise heavy season. But not everyone believed her, and not everyone was brave enough to stand against Don Rafael even with proof in hand, because he had spent decades cultivating fear in Rio Verde as carefully as other men cultivated crops. And there were those in town who warned Elena she was inviting ruin upon herself by challenging him, that a girl of 20 with no money and no family standing had no business taking on a man of his power. Don Rafael, for his part, did not wait passively. He began spreading his own version of events through the town, suggesting that Elena had forged the documents herself, that grief had made her desperate and dishonest, that the sudden appearance of a conveniently helpful ledger inside a plane wreck she alone had purchased was, at the very least, deeply suspicious. He pressured the land office to dismiss the old grants as invalid without proper government review, a process he assured everyone would take years and cost money Elena did not have. And for a dark stretch of days, it seemed as though the truth she had unearthed might simply be buried again, this time by influence and doubt rather than jungle and root. It was Padre Anselmo, in the end, who reminded Elena that a truth this old and this carefully preserved did not need to win an argument, only to be seen clearly by enough honest eyes, and it was that reminder that gave her the courage to do what she did next. Rather than wait for a land office beholden to Don Rafael's influence, she sent word downriver to the regional magistrate, a traveling judge named Doa Isabel Torres, known throughout the province for her fairness and her disinterest in local politics, requesting that she come to Rio Verde herself to examine the ledger, the land grants, and the letters, alongside witnesses from the founding families still living. It took 3 weeks for Doa Isabel to arrive, 3 weeks in which Elena worked quietly to gather every piece of corroborating evidence she could find, cross-referencing the ledger's boundary descriptions with the physical landmarks still standing along the river, interviewing the oldest residents of Rio Verde about what they remembered of the flood and the lost plane, and even locating, in the back room of the chapel, a water-damaged parish record that confirmed Captain Ezequiel Duarte had indeed flown out of Rio Verde on the night in question, never to return. When Doa Isabel finally arrived and convened her hearing in the town square, with what felt like the entire population of Rio Verde gathered to watch, Don Rafael arrived dressed in his finest suit, flanked by his own lawyer, prepared to dismiss the entire matter as the fabrication of a grieving, desperate young woman. But the evidence Elena presented was thorough and precise, laid out with the same careful attention her father had taught her to bring to any broken thing, and as Doa Isabel examined the government seals on the original land grants, comparing them against archived records she had brought from the provincial capital, it became clear, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the seals were authentic, the ledger genuine, and the land claims valid. Don Rafael's composure began, for the first time in Alina's memory, to crack, his voice rising as he insisted the documents must be forgeries, that no plane wreck could have preserved paper so perfectly for 60 years, until an elderly engineer from the capital, brought by Doa Isabel specifically to examine the case itself, explained to the gathered crowd that the steel container had in fact been built as a specialized dry seal transport case. A rare and expensive design meant precisely to protect important documents from moisture and decay, proof, if any more were needed, that whoever had loaded that case onto Captain Duarte's plane had understood exactly how precious its contents were and had taken every measure to ensure they would survive. The judgment, when it came, arrived not as a single dramatic thunderclap, but as a slow, steady unspooling of truth that left Don Rafael with nowhere left to stand. Doa Isabel ruled that the original land grants were valid and had never been legally superseded, that the debt paper he had produced against Elena's father bore signs of alteration a forensic examiner would later confirm, and that the parcels of land he had claimed over the years, including the very house Elena had grown up in, rightfully belonged to the founding families named in the ledger, Elena's own family chief among them. It was, in the truest sense, restoration rather than revenge, because Elena had never once, in all her planning, sought to see Don Rafael ruined or humiliated for its own sake. She had only wanted the truth returned to the people it belonged to, and if that truth happened to strip away the foundation of a fortune built on theft, that was simply the natural consequence of honesty finally being allowed to speak. Don Rafael did not go to prison, for his crimes, however serious, existed in a gray legal territory of falsified paperwork and decades-old fraud that Doa Isabel's court had neither the power nor perhaps the appetite to fully punish. But he lost, in the span of a single afternoon, nearly everything he had spent his life accumulating through fear and false paper, and within the year, unable to hold his position in a town that no longer trusted him, no longer feared him, no longer needed him, he quietly left Rio Verde altogether, moving downriver to some distant city where his name carried no weight, and his history could not follow him quite so closely. As for the gold coin mentioned in Captain Duarte's final letter, Elena found it exactly where the ledger described. In a second, smaller compartment welded beneath the steel case's false bottom, and rather than keep a single coin of it for herself, she brought the entire sum before the town council and asked that it be used, at long last, 60 years late, for the very purpose the founding families had always intended, the building of Rio Verde's first proper hospital, which the townspeople would eventually name, with quiet and unanimous agreement, the Duarte Marquez Clinic, honoring both the pilot who had died protecting their history and the family who had finally brought it home. Elena herself did not ask for the return of every parcel her family had originally held. She asked only for her father's house and workshop, content to let the other reclaimed lands return to the families who had waited 2 generations to hear their names spoken aloud in that careful, looping hand once more. And it was this quiet generosity, more than the discovery itself, that the people of Rio Verde would remember and speak of for years afterward. She was 20 years old when the world cast her out with nothing but 43 pesos and a grief too large for her young shoulders to carry. And it would have been easy, in that bitter season, for Elena Marquez to believe that she had been left with nothing at all. But she had been raised by a man who taught her that nothing broken is ever truly worthless, only waiting for someone patient enough to see what it still held. And it was that single, stubborn lesson that led her to spend her last 15 pesos on a rusted, jungle-buried plane that an entire town had already decided was cursed and empty of value. What she found there was never simply gold or paper or old government seals, though those things mattered greatly to the families whose land was restored, and the sick who would one day walk through the doors of a hospital 60 years overdue. What she truly found, sealed inside that steel case, was proof of something her father had believed his whole life, and had somehow, without ever explaining why, passed down to her. That value does not disappear simply because the world stops looking for it. That a name is not erased simply because it goes unspoken for 60 years. And that a person willing to walk into the parts of life everyone else has abandoned may just find, waiting there in the dark, exactly what an entire town has been quietly grieving the loss of all along. Elena Marquez did not set out to become the woman who saved Rio Verde. She only set out, in her lowest and most desperate hour, to trust the one thing her father had left her that no one could ever take away: the ability to see worth in what everyone else had already thrown away. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Elena's story tonight. If it moved you even a little, we would be so grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless. And if you're new here, please consider following or subscribing to our channel, because we bring you a new story like this one every week, each about ordinary people who found extraordinary strength in the hardest seasons of their lives. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories matter to us more than you know. Until next time, stay close.